Hér var fyrir helgina haldin mikil ráðstefna á vegum Eddu öndvegisseturs við Háskóla Íslands. Inequalities, Democracy and the Politics of Transition var nafnið þessari ráðstefnu, sem sagt ójöfnuður, lýðræði og stjórnmála á breytingatímum. Það voru mjög merkilegir gestir þarna. Einn af þeim var og Jon Elster, sem Norðmaður upprunalega en hefur starfað í Bandaríkjunum og Frakklandi, prófessor við Columbia háskólann í New York, höfundur margra bóka, og hann fjallaði þarna stjórnarskrárferlið íslenska, stjórnlagaráð og stjórnarskrárbreytingar. Það athyglisvert að heyra hvað útlendingur finnst. Þetta enda eitt mál sem mikið talað erlendis, að Íslendingar sé að breyta stjórnarskránni kannski meira en Íslendingar gera sér grein fyrir. Jon Elster, welcome to Silfri Egils. I was just going to ask you directly first, is it natural after a crash like happened in Iceland, after an economic collapse, to want to rewrite the constitution or write a new constitution?
Yes, I think that is quite natural. But let me reverse the question. Constitutions are almost only written after a crisis, after a defeat in war, after an economic crisis, after a revolution. So there's a very close connection between crisis and constitution making. In the Icelandic case, a financial crisis.
So this is a very natural reaction to what happened.
Well, if you go back to the 18th century, the French constitution making of 1789 was triggered by a financial crisis. In my opinion, the American Constitution of 1787 was also written in the wake of a financial crisis involving conflict between creditors and debtors.
Okay.
Just as here.
Just as here. Well, I'm going to ask you rather large questions, and I would like to hear your opinion about what you think are the strengths of this constitutional process that we sort of started after the crash.
I would like to say something before I answer. I would like to ask you and the viewers to take everything I say with a grain of salt, because of my lack of deep knowledge about your country. Although I am Norwegian, I do not read Icelandic, so everything I know is based on talks I had with people here and on documents available in English. So I may say things that are superficial or even wrong. Now, I think the strength of the process here is that the constitution making was entrusted to a special assembly that had only the task of writing a constitution, no other functions. Because I think there's a risk of entrusting constitution making to a parliament, because a parliament might tend to write an excessively large role for parliament into the constitution.
Yes.
A kind of institutional self-interest, if you want.
So having a constitutional assembly is basically a good idea.
It's a very good idea.
Free citizens.
That's what we had in Norway in 1814.
Yes.
And it worked well.
Yes. But then, of course, with this process, it has to be ratified by Parliament.
Well, that is the problem. But in fact, as I understand it, there's a double ratification that might have to happen by Parliament, according to the Constitution, yes, but also by a consultative referendum.
Yes.
And I think the best would be if the referendum came first. Because if the people approved the constitutional proposal, I think Parliament would find it difficult to override the moral authority of the people. And here I think, again, about my own country, Norway, where the people rejected twice entry into the common market and then into the European Union, although the vast majority of politicians were in favor. But Parliament accepted the voice of the people, and I think the Icelandic Parliament also would accept the voice of the people if the referendum came first.
But there are some weaknesses, of course, in the process. One is that it was, well, in a way, knocked down by the Supreme Court.
Well, there are several weaknesses. One is the low turnout in the elections, which obviously reduces to some extent the legitimacy of the elected council. And the other is, as you said, the invalidation by the Supreme Court, which may, in the eyes of some at least, make it appear less legitimate. I don't know how much that actually matters. Nobody can really tell. But it is possible that it will make it easier for Parliament to reject the proposal if Parliament doesn't like it. And I think it's somewhat likely that at least some members of Parliament will not like it, since the draft proposes to change the mode of election, which will end the overrepresentation of the countryside.
That's an interesting point, yes. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I rely here on my colleague, Professor Gylfason, and his work, who says that the districts in the countryside each voter in the countryside has 2 or 3, even 4 times the political influence as the voters in the Reykjavik area. Whereas the new constitution proposes equal political influence. And so one can see how some members of Parliament will be unhappy that their constituencies will lose members in a new Parliament.
Yes, well, we have, of course, the countryside with this inequality is overrepresented in Parliament. But in the Constitutional Assembly, you would see that the city is probably overrepresented. On the other hand,
I looked at the 25 names of the members of the council. There was one who was listed as farmer. The others seem to have more urban professions. I don't know if they all live around Reykjavik, the other 24, but it seems clear that the countryside is underrepresented in the council, although it is overrepresented in Parliament. So that's a bit of a paradox. I'm wondering if the countryside had been fairly represented on the council, maybe some of its decisions might have been different, or maybe there would have been less of a consensus on the document. But that is, of course, just speculation.
Yes. But do you think, well, that's of course, I don't know how you will answer this. Do you think this is a good place to start from, this constitution? Is it you've read it through, is it a good constitution?
I think the substance of the document, as far as I can judge, is excellent. I think the new electoral system is good. I think the declaring that natural resources are public ownership of natural resources is very good. Strengthening the separation of powers, for instance, with respect to the appointment of judges, is very good. So I think it has many good features, and as far as I can see, it does not have any crying or obvious flaws. There may be some hidden flaws because it's often very difficult to detect ahead of time the flaws of a constitution. Often you only discover the flaws when it is put to work, as shown, for instance, by the history of the Weimar Constitution.
Yes, of course. But some people would say that this process is too hurried. We're doing this in too much hurry.
Well, you need to ride the wave of passion. And passion has a short half-life. So, in a way, I think it was a good idea to do it quickly. Now it seems as if perhaps the momentum has gone. And also, one of the factors that triggered indignation that called for the Constitutional Assembly in the first place, the financial crisis, seems more or less to have been solved without the Constitution. Iceland is now held up as a model for other debt-ridden countries in Europe. So one might be forgiven for asking, why a constitution? We can fix the problem without the constitution. So that may also reduce the momentum. But I nevertheless think that the constitution is a good document, and it should be adopted in more or less the form it stands now, or perhaps modified a bit. So to return to your question, no, I don't think it was too hurried. I think if one had gone through the usual slow procedures in Parliament, I think the draft would have been buried in some committee.
Buried in some committee, as has happened before in this country. Thank you for coming to Silfri Egils, Jon Elster.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Hingað